will resign as leader of the Labour Party. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
To serve the country I love.
On June 22nd, 2026, Sir Keir Starmer stood outside Downing Street and announced his resignation as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Right after the announcement, every media outlet was competing to release story about it. They were talking about immediate drama, every possible reasons that led to his resignation. A massive scandal over a top diplomat appointment,
Not paying attention to the detail. Peter Mandelson, it turns out, was flagged as a security risk before the vetting had even started. And Keir Starmer didn't want to know. He doesn't want to know.
ministers arguing over military budget, and his plummeting approval ratings. And when the Britons scroll through social media, it's just total chaos. Half the internet is celebrating. The other half is exhausted by yet another wave of British political drama. Now we are not going to talk about gossip. We want to talk about why this keeps happening. Why do UK prime ministers keep quitting? Sir Keir Starmer is now the sixth British Prime Minister to leave the office since 2016. So it's seven leaders in just 10 years. Most of the news commentators treat this like a reality TV show, a tragic parade of bad decisions, poor communications, or weak leaders, you name it. But let's be honest, if you buy a car and the engine explodes 7 times in a row, you stop blaming the drivers. Instead, you realize that there is something seriously wrong with the way the car was built. In this video, we're going to look past all of those angry tweets and the news headlines. Instead, we're going to look at the real underlying blueprint of the British economy. Our main point today is very simple. British prime ministers are not failing because they are all uniquely bad at their jobs. They're failing because they are trying to run a country using an economic model that are completely out of gas. They are trapped in a corner where what the voters want and what the country can actually afford simply do not match. And now let's look at how the machine actually broke down. To understand why Sir Keir Starmer resigned, we have to go back nearly 20 years to the global financial crash of 2008. So every country has a specific engine it uses to make money, to create jobs, to keep the society stable. In the academic world, this is called a growth regime. Think of it simply as a country's business model. From the late 1980s up until 2008, the UK had a highly specific business model that worked incredibly well. It relied on three main pillars. First, a booming deregulated financial sector in the City of London that made massive profits and paid huge taxes. Second, a constant flow of cheap skilled workers from the European Union. Third, sky-high house prices made the homeowners, especially the middle class, feel rich, which encouraged everyone to keep spending money. Because this model was printing cash, the government didn't really bother investing in local factories, new technologies, or northern infrastructure. London itself generated enough tax revenue to pay for the country's public service, while the rest of the UK got by on the service sector jobs and the rising property values. And then the 2008 arrived, and the engine completely melted down. The financial crash was not just a bad recession, it permanently broke the UK's business model. The hypergrowth in London's financial district stopped and productivity growth completely flatlined. Now, productivity sounds like a boring corporate buzzword, but it is actually the holy grail of economics. It's just a measure of how much value a worker creates in an hour. If productivity goes up, companies can pay higher wages and the government collects more taxes. Before 2008, the British productivity grew by a healthy 2.3% every single year. Since 2008, it dropped to less than 0.5% a year.
Before 2008, productivity grew at 2.1% every year. After the financial crisis, it collapsed to just 0.6%. That tiny difference means the average British worker now produces roughly 25% less than they.
The economists call this the productivity puzzle.
My talk today will be about productivity, and more specifically about the UK productivity puzzle.
But politically, it is a graveyard of British Prime Minister. Think about the math. If productivity does not grow, wages will stall. If wages stall, tax revenues dry up. But hospitals, schools, roads still cost money to run, especially with an aging population. If your income stops growing but your bills keep going up, you only have two choices: borrow massive amounts of money or raise taxes to historic highs. For the last 16 years, instead of building a new economic machine, British politicians have just been trying to manage the decline of the old one. Every prime minister since 2016 has walked into Downing Street with a different theoretical fix to jumpstart this broken machine. Let's look at how those experiments blew up one by one. The first massive shift happened in 2016 with Brexit. From an economic standpoint, Brexit was a wild attempt to fix our domestic issues by completely smashing up our international trade rules. Since then, the government has cycled through four distinct economics experiments before Keir Starmer even entered the building. Theresa May took over the 10 Downing Street in 2016. She looked at the country and she realized that massive regional inequality was ripping society apart. Her solution, a bit of state intervention. She wanted a soft Brexit, meaning keeping the UK closely tied to Europe to protect local factories and supply chains, combined with a government backed industrial plan. And then why did she fail? Because her economic reality clashed with her party's political identity. The right wing of the party didn't care about supply chains, they wanted pure sovereignty. May was crushed because you cannot run a business model when your shareholders care more about a political slogan than the math to keeping the business alive. Then came the big spender Boris Johnson in 2019 with a totally different playbook called leveling up. His plan was simple. The government would borrow billions of pounds at super low interest rates and flood the neglected north of England with cash. The economists call this debt fueled regional Keynesianism. We can just call it as a massive state funded shopping spree. For a second, it worked politically, but it was entirely vulnerable to bad luck. When COVID 19 hit, followed by the war in Ukraine, the global trade choked and inflation skyrocketed. Central banks had to hike interest rates to stop inflation. And overnight, the era of cheap money vanished. Borrowing money became wildly expensive, and Johnson's big spending plan became unaffordable, and state ran out of cash. And this brings us to the infamous 44 days of the hyper gambler Liz Truss in the late 2022. So her experiment is an absolute classic because it was a direct confrontation, head-on collision between a radical government and global financial markets. Liz Truss believed that Britain's economy was stuck because taxes were too high and regulation were too tight. And her fix, she announced £45 billion in massive tax cuts for corporation and high earners without explaining how she'd pay for it. Well, she just hoped that it would shock the economy into growth. Like, how on earth does she think that we're isolated? We're not isolated. The government don't operate in vacuum. There are outside forces that we cannot fully control, that we have to consider, that the politicians should put into their mind for every choice they make. Well, to spend the money, they rely on the global investors to buy their debt, government bonds. But what do you think when the financial market saw a country with almost zero growth and they were planning to borrow a mountain of cash to fund millionaire tax cuts during an inflation crisis? Of course, they will panic. The investor dumped the British bond. Pension funds almost collapsed in an afternoon, and the pound tanked. The markets essentially pulled the emergency brake on the government, and forcing the political establishment via the Bank of England to step in and effectively remove Liz Truss to save the financial system. Here comes the strict accountant Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak was brought in as the cleanup guy. He has to clean up the mess. His model was simple: absolute fiscal orthodoxy, or in plain English, acting like a strict accountant. His entire job was to prove to the global markets that Britain could pay its bills. He did this by squeezing public spending and using a clever trick called fiscal drag.
Fiscal drag's a real drag.
It certainly is. And what do we mean by fiscal drag? It's pretty simple, really. When you have a tax threshold, say the start where you start paying tax, if you start paying income tax, believe it or not, if you earn more than £12,570, right?
That's your personal allowance.
That's your personal allowance. If you freeze that, but then you have inflation and your wages go up, more and more of your wage and more people are dragged into above that threshold. It's the same at the top rate of tax. And what's happened today is that HMRC, the tax man, as we say, has released figures on how many more people are going to be dragged into paying income tax in the first place and into these upper tax brackets.
He froze tax threshold, meaning as inflation pushed wages up on the paper, millions of ordinary people, middle income earners, were automatically dragged into higher tax brackets without the government officially announcing a tax hike. Smart. And Sunak successfully calmed the stock market, but he starved the country. By the time he left the office in 2024, the NHS, the publicly funded healthcare system in the United Kingdom, had recorded a waiting list. Local councils were declaring bankruptcy, and roads were falling apart. So he saved the bond market, but he destroyed the social fabric of the country. He traded social stability for market stability. Until now, we already see that every single of these leaders tried to fix the exact same broken engine with different tools, and every single one of them failed. Which brings us directly to the trap that just snapped shut on Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer won a massive landslide victory in July 2024. To the casual observer, Starmer's victory looked like a total reset. But if you look at the economics, he walked straight into a trap that he helped build. Starmer and his chancellor Rachel Reeves built their entire governance strategy on a theory called securonomics, a modern supply-side economics. They promised global investors that they would be incredibly responsible. They swore they would stick to strict budget rules. no raising the main rates of income tax, VAT, or national insurance, and they promised to get the national debt falling. So now the question is, how did they plan to fix the crumbling NHS, repair the schools, and rescue bankrupt local councils without raising tax or borrowing money? Their entire strategy relied on one massive gamble: rapid economic growth. They argued that by cutting through red tape, updating planning laws, and building 1.5 million homes, they would unleash a wave of private investment. That investment would kickstart the economy, they thought, and automatically generating billions in new tax revenues. They thought they could grow their way out of trouble. It is beautiful, huh? On paper, unfortunately. The mathematic of the post Brexit British state completely refused to cooperate. When the economic data for 2025 and early 2026 came in, economic growth did not soar. It stayed stuck at a miserable flatline 1%. How come? Because the structural headwinds were just too strong. Take the housing promises, for example. House building actually fell to a 9-year low. Why? Because you can't fix a massive housing crisis just by changing a planning manual. High interest rates made construction loan way too expensive. Building materials were held up by post-Brexit trade friction, and private developers simply refused to build houses at financial loss. At the same time, because inflation stays sticky, ordinary people felt a severe economic squeeze. Because tax threshold remains frozen, which increases on paper simply drag workers into higher tax brackets, and that is the fiscal drag we talk about in the Rishi Sunak section. People were taking home less real money, all while public services continued to slide. By mid 2026, the trap snapped shut. Because growth flatlined, Starmer ran completely out of money. He's caught in an impossible vice. On one side, working people and trade unions like Unite were furious, accusing the government of protecting the financial market instead of fixing the country. On the other side, global conflicts in the Middle East meant that UK urgently needed to spend billions more on defense. When Starmer tried to find the military by cutting money from the other government departments, his own cabinet mutinied. They revolted.
British Defence Secretary John Healey has resigned, citing concerns over the UK government's defence spending plans. In his resignation letter to Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Healey said the proposed defence investment plan does not provide the resources needed to address current security challenges.
The resignation of the Defense Secretary John Healey wasn't just a political argument. It was a desperate fight over a shrinking pile of cash. The final blow, the Mendelssohn ambassadorial scandal. It was the political spark that lit the fuse. Starmer's entire brand was built on being clean, competent manager who followed the rules. Once his integrity was smashed and he had no economic growth to show for his strict discipline, he had absolutely nothing left to stand on. The machine broke and it took him down with it. So where do we go from here? If we look at how global investors reacted to Starmer's resignation, we notice something very interesting. Unlike the absolute panic when Liz Truss resigned, the financial markets right now stayed completely calm. Government bond prices didn't shift and the pound held steady. How come? Because the big credit rating agencies know that Britain's underlying system is incredibly resilient. They trust the Chancellor Rachel Reeves built deep financial discipline into the treasury. The markets are not panicking at all because they know that whoever takes over the keys to the Downing Street is still bound by the exact same strict economic constraint. But politically, the game is changing. The fact that the Labour Party is rapidly uniting behind the former mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, it signals a massive ideological shift. For the last 40 years, the British political economy has been always London first, Westminster centric. The theory was always that the City of London would make the money and the government would then distribute it to the rest of the country. Andy Burnham's rise marks the arrival of what people are calling as Manchesterism. This is a totally different way of looking at the economy. It is a regional, hands on strategy. It completely rejects the idea that if you just cut red tape, private investor will magically save public services. Instead, it focuses on the state taking direct control of the local assets, bringing public transport back under the public control, building local social housing, and handing real economic power over to the regions. Burnham has already dropped hints that he wants to talk about the wealth taxes and raising personal tax threshold to stop the fiscal drag that crippled Starmer. But here is the ultimate reality check. Can Manchesterism actually work where every other experiment failed? Fixing local bus and building regional housing is great for optimizing a local economy, but it cannot single handedly fix the national productivity puzzle. It cannot magically erase the permanent trade frictions created by Brexit either. Burnham, or whoever ultimately wins the crowns and the keys to the Downing Street, is going to inherit the exact same broken mathematical ledger that destroyed Keir Starmer. To wrap everything up, stops looking at the British politics as just a dramatic reality TV show. The UK is a real time example of what happens when a major global economy loses its main engine and refuses to build a new one. Prime ministers are spinning through the door of number 10 at Downing Street because they are being handed an impossible math problem to solve. Until the UK addresses its deepest structural problems, such as its massive planning bottlenecks, its post Brexit trade realities, its chronic lack of investment in local infrastructure, and its obsession with house prices over real worker productivity, the door at the Downing Street will just keep on spinning. All right, if you prefer this structural breakdown over standard media headline outrage, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment with your thoughts on Andy Burnham, and share this video with someone who wants to understand how the system actually works. Thank you for diving deep with me today, and remember, sapere aude, dare to know. Ciao!